across the European Union.
Join our political correspondent Ian Watson, who's following developments from Westminster. And Ian, now that the paper's been published, what more can you tell us about the substance of it?
Yes, well, Anita, this is the paper published just a few moments ago, effectively looking at the role of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, after Brexit. Now, quite clearly what the government says that it is doing is ending the direct jurisdiction of the ECJ. They're very clear about what that means. It means decisions taken by the European Court of Justice would no longer automatically apply in Britain, and equally that court would have no right to strike out British domestic legislation as it does at the moment. But this document actually makes it very clear that the ECJ may still have quite a big influence depending on what kind of trade agreement, for example, we might strike with the European Union in future. And what the government does is not settle on any particular new mechanism or court for sorting out any of these disputes if a new agreement is reached. Instead, it comes up with a whole range of precedents. Partly that is political, because it points out that in each of these precedents, in each of these existing cases, the European Court of Justice does not have a direct role in policing those agreements. But equally, they're also suggesting that perhaps bits of these agreements could be looked at. They want to open a discussion with their European partners on some of this. And in some cases, for example, you may not have heard of this before, I certainly am no expert in it myself, but the Moldova EU agreement would give the ECJ the absolute right to interpret European Union legislation and would bind any disputes panel with that interpretation. So there would still be a continuing role for the European Court of Justice. Where the government is really clear in this document, though, is that the European Court of Justice should have no say over enforcing the rights of EU residents living in the United Kingdom. And for reaction to this, I'm joined by, if you like, two sides of the argument. Firstly by John Redwood, who's campaigned for Brexit, and in a moment by Chuka Umunna from the Labour Party, who of course campaigned for Britain to remain in the European Union. First of all, John Redwood, ending the direct jurisdiction of the ECJ, something you are in favour of, but under some of these scenarios for our future arrangements with the EU, it could still have a big influence.
No, I don't agree. That isn't what the paper says at all. The paper very clearly says once we leave in March 2019 or earlier, the ECJ will no longer have jurisdiction in the UK, although of course it will have jurisdiction over British people living on the continent under European law. And it goes on to say that if, for example, we have a trade agreement, they may want to have a trade agreement, we're offering them a very generous free trade agreement, then the most obvious model for resolving any disputes under that is to accept the World Trade Organization disputes procedure, because they have a disputes procedure and an appeal procedure. The EU accepts that for trade with non-EU countries at the moment. We would be very willing, I'm sure, to accept that for our trade agreement if we get one with the EU.
Okay, coming to Chuka Umunna, you've also seen this paper very briefly in the last few minutes.
Yeah, it's been through the various.
John Redwood was saying that there's no real influence here for the ECJ, but it appears to be, because if you're an arbitration panel trying to sort out a dispute between the UK and the EU, we cannot, and that arbitration panel cannot insist on its interpretation of EU law.
Well, I think that's there's something to be said for that, but what I ask people to go back to is the promise that was made to you when you voted to leave the European Union, and you were basically told European judges will no longer have influence on UK law, and that is wrong. Clearly in this paper, it foresees at least account being taken of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice under some of those scenarios. That is materially different to what you were sold during the EU referendum. And this points to a wider story over the summer, is that so many of these promises, like the £350 million extra per week that we were promised would go into public services if you left the European Union, are impossible to deliver. If you're going to pay a divorce bill, as it were, for us to leave the European Union and make continuing payments for us to access the single market, as it seems to be the policy of the government, you're not going to be able to bring that £350 million extra per week for our NHS that people were promised. And this is the thing. That EU referendum, when John and I were arguing, was a thing about hypotheticals. But now we are beginning to have the hard facts that illustrate that Brexit, in the terms it was sold to your viewers, is impossible to deliver. And just look at this.
Which is not true. I mean, this is just false and foolish, all these assertions. This paper,
like they're facts.
No, they're not. This paper, like the ones before it, make it very clear. No, there's no legal obligation for any divorce bill at all, and I am very strongly of the view that there should be no divorce payments. We will pay our contributions up to the date of leaving, as the Leave campaign always said we would and should, and as the government is going to do. But on this paper, it is very clear in the paper, the ECJ's jurisdiction, their court's jurisdiction, ends the day we leave the European Union. It has a number of models in there that help other people in their different circumstances, but that isn't isn't going to be the British model. The British model, as I say, under trade, is very likely to be that we will accept World Trade Organization jurisdiction, just as the EU does for dealing with other independent countries around the world. We are going to become an independent country, and that is the best way of doing it for trade.
That's what we would do if there was a no-deal scenario. But there are some other...
No, but if there's a deal scenario, why wouldn't we use the World Trade... No, if there is a deal, why wouldn't we use the World Trade Organization to resolve any disputes under it? Because it will need registering at the World Trade Organization. They're the superior body to the EU in matters of world trade, and rightly so. We're a member, the EU is a member, and if there is a deal, it would be best policed by the WTO.
What John Rodwood's saying is, like, this isn't all that complicated. The WTO rules already exist. We could simply
Well, he wants
them.
us to jump off a cliff and be governed by those rules.
I did not say that. Don't lie about me.
I don't. But the long and the short of it is, with this paper, you were told at the referendum, no influence, no power, no account taken of the decisions of European judges. This paper flies in the face of that. That is the hard fact.
Let me ask you one question on this, if you can forgive me for a moment. But just on Labour's position, are you saying that influence, whether people were missold that or not, is that influence a good influence? Is it right that the ECJ should still have some kind of influence? Is that your position? Or are you saying, in effect, that you wish the government had cut all ties with the ECJ?
I don't want all ties to be cut, because I think in the end you have to have compromise to continue to have some of the benefits. So if you look at the Euratom, the European Nuclear Energy Agency, which governs the transportation of nuclear materials across the European Union, but also has an impact on cancer research here, the use of medical isotopes. The reason we're being yanked out of that by the government is because of Theresa May's red line on the European Court of Justice having influence, and that impacts on and interrelates with that agency. Now, I don't think we should be having that red line if it's going to detrimentally affect your viewers' cancer treatment. I just don't think that's sensible to me. I think there's a bit of give and take in this situation, and that's why I don't think it should be a red line.
We can do these things for ourselves perfectly well as an independent country, and we will collaborate with the EU where we wish it and they agree to that. And it is best to have these international agreements policed under international law, because there are bodies and procedures that already do that are independent. You cannot have a court of one country policing the decisions of another country.
You're very clear that this document suggests that will end.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, John, Redwood and Chuka Umunna, the debates still continue, the referendum may be over, but how we go about Brexit still proving hugely controversial, and perhaps this relationship with the ECJ one of the most controversial issues of all, Anita.
OK, Ian, thank you very much. Ian Watson, well, I'll be